What have we got in our Baroque orchestra? Well, really very few players. We've only got string players in this piece in the orchestra. Yes, we've got a solo flute and we've got a harpsichord, and I'll explain that special role in a second. But we didn't have oboes and bassoons and trumpets and horns that we could have had in a Baroque orchestra, but Bach wanted to keep this particular orchestra even smaller. When we look at the Star Wars, you realise just how large a modern symphony orchestra can be. It could easily be 100 players. But in this piece, we're looking for a very small set of players to allow the soloists to shine. So who are our soloists? We've got the violin, and we've got the flute, and we've got the harpsichord. Now, this is a special moment in the history of the harpsichord, because the harpsichord in an orchestra was always providing the harmonies that we need, because the orchestra is really small. So the problem with such a small orchestra is that we haven't got anybody just to get the chords done for us. So like you might in a modern pop group, you might need guitars to play the chords because the pop group's quite small. In the Baroque period, the group was quite small. We want people to play lots of different melody lines and bass lines, so who's going to play the chords? Well, that was the job of the harpsichord. So this piece is groundbreaking because the harpsichord in an orchestra, in a solo setting of other solo instruments, suddenly became the soloist as well. So this is really the first piece where we can say the harpsichord is the soloist in a concerto grosso. So it's really groundbreaking. Why do we think Bach did that? Well, it's actually quite simple. He just bought a new harpsichord, which cost him a lot of money and was really lovely to play, and he was a great player, so he thought he would show it off. This is a set of pieces designed to show off his composing, but maybe he wanted to show off his playing and his new instrument as well. So the harpsichord, for the first time in Brandenburg's 5th Concerto Grosso, is a soloist. So this is our solo group. And we're going to call those the concertino. So that's sort of Italian for little. So the little concert group. So concertino is our solo group. And then we've got other violins. And we've got violas. And we've got cellos. We put that little dash there to say it should be violoncello, but nobody ever says that, we just say cellos. And we've got double basses. Well, in fact, we've only got one double bass. We should really only have one double bass. So look how tiny our orchestra is. Violins, he doesn't say how many violins. In a modern orchestra, we could have easily 30 extra violins. In this orchestra, maybe 1 or 2, so it's tiny. Violins, violas, maybe only 1 viola. It could be 2, it could be 3. He doesn't say. It depends how many people the conductor of any performance of this wants to include. But we need a separate violin part to the solo. So these are different parts. Viola, as we know, is a slightly bigger violin, and it can make slightly lower sounds than cello, lower still, and obviously the double bass lower still. So that is our orchestra group. And we've got a special name for them too. That is the ripieno. The ripieno group is the orchestra, not the soloists. Concertino, soloists, ripieno, the rest of the orchestra. But what about this third group? So actually, they're already there. We need someone to play the chords. And we need someone to play the bass line. Well, actually, the cellos and the double bass generally in this period play the same music. The double bass is bigger, so what he plays or she plays, and it would have been a he in 1720, but what they play would sound an octave lower than the cello, but they generally play the same music. But there's a special bond between these players, the harpsichord and a bass instrument. In another piece, it could be a wind bass instrument, it could be a bassoon, but in this piece, we're going to use the players we've already got. Why? The why is that we need to have the harpsichord playing the chords and the bass line. But really the harpsichord isn't a very loud instrument for playing a bass line. It's not even a very good instrument at playing chords because the notes die really quickly. On the piano we play a note so we can hold that note for quite a long time. On a harpsichord it goes dink and dies away. So whereas on a piano I can play and hold that note for as long as I like, really. We can't do that on the harpsichord. We have to play repeated notes, otherwise it will just go dink and die away. So on the piano we can play the chord, but on the harpsichord we have to fiddle around with the notes. So piano, harpsichord, so the most common thing you can do is that spread, playing the same notes but playing them in turn rather than all together. So the harpsichord is a bit limited for being able to sustain the sound. The piano is so good at sustaining the sound, and when we get on to the Beethoven that we're going to study, which is a piano piece, we'll see why the piano can play melodies at different volumes to the accompaniment and why it's a very successful instrument for playing lyrically, playing melodies that can really sing, whereas the harpsichord can't really play melodies that can sing, it can play busy melodies. So the harpsichord will be doing a lot of the chords and a lot of the fiddly stuff to make the chords sound, whereas they would just die. That's the way the harpsichord gets its real character. But it's also not very good at playing the bass line, so the left hand of the harpsichord will play the bass line generally, and the right hand will play the fiddly chords. But because we're not really going to hear that, any Baroque composer that uses a harpsichord in an orchestra will add the cellos and double basses, playing exactly the same thing as the left hand. And we'll have a look at that in the score to prove it. So when the harpsichord in this piece is playing the solo stuff, it is not playing the same as the cello and the double bass. It's not doubling. We call it doubling when we have different instruments playing the same thing. So the cello and the double bass will double the harpsichord left hand when the harpsichord is being a team player to play the chords. But when it's playing the solo stuff, it's not going to be playing the same as the cello and double bass. And that is the first real time that we get that in a concerto, where the harpsichord has two jobs. It has the job of being the team player to play the chords and play the same thing as the cello and double bass, the bass line. But then it has its, okay, guys, it's my turn to show off. So it has some solo moments too. We have if we've got a special name for the solo group and we've got a special name for the orchestral players, we've also got a special name for the little team of harpsichord and bass line, either cellos or double basses, or in some cases both. And we call that basso, which is bass, continuo. So basso continuo does not mean continuous bass line. There's a piece we're going to play and learn later by Purcell where we do get a continuous bass line, and we have another term for that. So we just have to think of a basso continuo is a team of the harpsichord, and of a bass instrument. It doesn't even have to be a harpsichord. It could be something else from that period that plays chords. So it could be a lute, which is a type of very old-fashioned guitar. So now you can see we've got a very small orchestra, only strings in this Bach orchestra. We've got the solo group that we call the concertina, And that, in this case, is the violin, the flute, and the harpsichord. It's important you get used to thinking violin, flute in that order, because that is the order that they play in. The violin comes in first, then the flute, and then the harpsichord. So that's our solo group. This is our orchestra, the ripieno group. The solo group is the concertina group. But we've also got this subset, which is important. It is so important to Baroque music that it gets its own name, the basso continuo. If you're thinking of a pop group, you'd be thinking of perhaps the piano, bass and drums, or the rhythm guitar, bass and drums, as being the backing team group where all of the other people with the solo electric guitar and the singer can do all of their melody stuff over the top. But we need the core group to play the basic rhythm, the basic chords, the basic bass line. So this is like the Baroque equivalent of the backline instruments of a pop group. Basso continuo, usually a harpsichord and cello, double bass, bassoon. It could be something else, but we need a chord option, something we can play chords, and something we can play a bass line. Now remember, the harpsichord does play the bass line, but it doesn't do a very good job of it because it can't be heard. So they need something else that they can sustain the sound and get the bass line heard. That's the Baroque orchestra that Bach used. It is possible other Baroque orchestras have other players in them, but we just have strings in this. I'm going to put up a little clip now of a previous student's work where they created a little video to show how the orchestra developed. Because in the Baroque period, the orchestra was tiny, and in the classical period, Mozart and Beethoven's time, we added instruments like the clarinets, and maybe a couple of horns became more common, maybe a second flute player, so we'd have two flute players, two oboe players. And then in the Romantic period, the orchestra became large, maybe 80 players, maybe 5 different clarinets, maybe 5 French horns, certainly a couple of trumpets, certainly 3 trombones and a tuba, and it became massive. So I'm now going to put up a little video of someone who brings that development of the orchestra from the Baroque period until the late Romantic period to life. And remember, the beginning of the Baroque period is 1600, and the end of the Romantic period is really 1900. We've got 300 years of development of the orchestra from the Baroque to the late Romantic.